I'd been thinking of replacing this old smoker for the longest time, but wasn't sure how I would do it. And then I decided to add a grill to the outdoor kitchen, and even better, to build it myself. Did I mention that I'm a woodworker and concrete is a mystery to me? I guess we're going to find out. I normally use the griddle on the screen porch, but I like the idea of being able to grill outside. So the first order of business was to dig up the old smoker in order to clear a spot to build the grill. The old smoker had seen better days, and it took a good bit of effort to dig it up, but like an old warhorse past its prime, it finally came up. I had some bricks lying around from another project, so I planned to use those to make the grill. When I bought my griddle, there was a defect in the base, so the company replaced it, which gave me an extra pan that I could use as the base to hold coals. Since it was the griddle pan, I knew it could withstand the heat of burning coals and wood. So now that I had all the basics covered, I needed to begin the process of clearing a spot for the grill and then leveling out the location. Once the ground had been leveled, I laid down the griddle pan that would hold the coals, and then created a frame around it so I knew the pan would fit easily into the grill. I made sure my frame was 90 degrees on either side. I've never done any masonry, so I got pre-mixed mortar so I wouldn't have to worry about how much sand to add to the mixture. All I needed to do was put the mortar into my mixing container and add water.
An increasing number of Salvadorans are returning to their country from the U.S. The country is giving me the confidence I need to move.
I watched a number of videos as guys talked about the consistency of the mortar and started out using a hoe, but quickly realized that a small garden shovel worked a lot better for the amount of mortar I needed. The bag instructions said it shouldn't be watery, but also should not be flaky. So making mortar is a delicate balance in order to get it to bond. Once I had my mortar mixed, I began forming the frame that would support the grill, making sure to add enough mortar between each brick and then working it in and smoothing it out as I went along. I'll admit, it felt like adding peanut butter in between the spaces.
Vaccines have become a divisive issue in American politics. But there is one thing all parties can agree on. The U.S. faces a crisis of public trust. It sounds like you also think there is a crisis in public trust. But then my question is, if so, what's...
Another consideration was staggering the bricks to help distribute the weight, but meant every now and then I had to stop and cut off a portion of a brick to make it fit. I used a chisel that I hit with a hammer to break the pieces off, and somehow never got around to filming myself doing that. I can say I got better as I went along, because I began to understand that you needed to tap each brick to seat it into the mortar. And as each level was created, the outline of the frame began to take shape, and I felt more comfortable with what I was doing. And then I reached the point where I needed to add rebar that would support the tray for the coals. I only needed 31 inches, but the shortest rebar I could find was 48. So, once everything was done, I would have to get a grinder to cut off the extra. But that was a mountain I would have to climb later. For now, I needed to get it into the frame of the grill. On one side, it would rest in the mortar between the bricks. But because of the staggering, on the other side, it would sit on top of the bricks, embedded in the mortar. This would be my last task on the first day, because, as you can probably tell, it was beginning to get dark, and I was almost out of mortar. So, I would scrape the bottom of the container and call it a day. Little did I know, scraping that last bit of mortar was not a good idea. The next day, I realized I had allowed that last bit of mortar to dry out, and it had not bonded well on the right side. So, I had to chip it out around the rebar and redo that section. A good night's sleep allows you to be forgiving, and I accepted that it was worth it to redo that part. It was also clear that even though I was in the shade, it made sense to start as early as possible to avoid the heat of the day. As I redid the right section, I was feeling good about my work, and even a little proud that I had gotten this far. I'm still amazed that I didn't film breaking off this little piece to finish off the right front. And then on to the next level of rebar that would hold the grates for grilling. I followed pretty much the same process I used on the first level. Rebar in between the mortar on the left and on top of the brick in the mortar on the right. I then followed up and created a flat frame for the top that I hoped would give a more finished look to the grill. As I put in the back flat frame, I will admit to being a little surprised that what started out as simply an idea for a grill was actually beginning to take shape. Once the top section was done, I went back and pointed the joints to push mortar deep into the joints and brush off any burrs of mortar, like I did the day before, but also didn't film. I accept that I will probably not build a brick house for anyone, because in some ways my work is not perfect. But I learned a lot along the way, and I built myself a grill while I was learning. And if it caves in tomorrow, I now know I could build it back even better. After waiting a couple of days to allow the mortar to cure, it was time to test out just how well the grill worked by lighting a fire. It seemed to work pretty well for my purposes. All that remained was that one last mountain to climb that involved a trip to Harbor Freight for a cheap grinder to cut off the excess rebar. One pass to get the longest part off, and then a second to smooth it down. Not bad for my first time using a $15 grinder and a $7 cutoff wheel. So, I guess you could say I'm in business with the grill. See you next time.